guys, welcome to the Bill Barnwell Show. I am Bill Barnwell here, as we are each and every week, in your podcast feed and on YouTube for the Monday Night Football recap here on Tuesday morning. Second week in a row, I have seen something that I have never seen before covering football. Chargers 22, Eagles 19. We've seen stuff like that before. We've seen sloppy games from both teams. We've seen quarterbacks playing through injuries. Actually, there are two things I believe I have never seen before. A stat, which we'll get to later on, and a play for the second consecutive week. Joining me to talk about that play, talk about just a lot of football kind of packed into this game. A lot of stuff happened in this game. Joining me to talk about that, our Bengals beat reporter at ESPN, but someone who does great work covering the NFL, someone who has seen a wider range of football than so many other people, someone who covered high school football in Texas, which I feel like is the most concentrated, intense version of football available to the American public. Joining me today, my friend from ESPN, Ben Baby. Ben, how are you?
Bill, it is a pleasure. Yes, we saw some football tonight. I don't know if it was good, but it was football. Also, as I told you right before we went live, not the ideal game to go to overtime for someone who woke up at 5 a.m. in Buffalo this morning. So it's been a long day. And to your earlier point, I realized over the weekend, I am probably one of the few people in the country who's covered a football game on one end of the United States in Laredo, Texas, and also on the other end in Buffalo, New York. So it's nice to span the NAFTA version of the football spectrum in America here.
And probably the widest range of potential temperatures for football games as well.
Yes, unfortunately, though, no Taco Palenque in Buffalo. We need to get that remedied, along with just a nationwide distribution of the greatest chain restaurant in the country.
You did find Indian American barbecue, though, in Buffalo, if I'm not mistaken?
That is correct. Yes. As an Indian American, also that restaurant is from my specific region where my family's from in India in the state of Kerala. So I had to go there. I feel like it would disrespect both of my heritages if I didn't go. And the food was incredible. When the food hit the table, nobody spoke for 10 minutes. So I highly, highly recommend Southern Junction in Buffalo if you go. But a much tastier dish than what we got tonight in this Monday Night Football game.
Ooh. That is a good, for someone who got up at 5 a.m. in Buffalo, not a bad transition, Mr. Baby. I respect that. There were not a lot of smooth transitions in this game. It was either just like, it was one team slamming into the other, turning the ball over, turning the ball back. 8 turnovers in this game, including the final play with Jalen Hurts throwing a ball into tight coverage when the Eagles were already in field goal range, having his pass tipped by Cam Hart on one hand, and then picked off by Tony Jefferson with one hand, ending the game for the Eagles, 22-19. A very close game. It wasn't like either of these teams pulled away. They each had their moments, a couple big plays. The Saquon Barkley has a long touchdown run, a 52-yarder. Right at the beginning, Kamani Vidal has a 60-yard reception for the Chargers to set up their touchdown. A lot of field goals. One missed field goal by Jake Elliott, which probably proved to be the difference in this one. But I want to start with Jalen Hurts and this Eagles offense. And if you are even remotely aware of what is happening in Philadelphia on a weekly basis, Eagles fans hate this offense. They hate Nick Sirianni. They hate Kevin Patullo, whose role in prep was reportedly diminished. And I understand why. I understand that the offense does not look good. There's been a lot of frustrating parts. It's the most expensive offense in NFL history by cash spent. Bringing back the 10 best players from an offense that was dominant last year all the way to the Super Bowl and getting pretty middling and mediocre results. And from the outside, it's the easiest thing in the world to blame coaches. And clearly coaches do deserve some blame for what happens when their teams are on the field. And I think, people who have looked very closely at the Eagles offense have said, hey, maybe, the design isn't necessarily all that great. They're missing some opportunities. But I watched this game, Ben, and it just felt like so many of the mistakes in this game were on the players. It just felt like there were drops, there were ill-advised throws, there was poor management, there was some sloppy blocking. From the Eagles offense side, if you were an Eagles fan, what would you take away from this game and say, okay, this is the thing we need to fix to get this offense back on track?
That's a great question, Bill, because if you're an Eagles fan, you cannot be feeling good about this
No.
offense. And it's just, it looks out of sync. And I think that the play for me was that deep ball that Jalen Hurts tried for A.J. Brown in overtime. And it was a ball that just, it never seemed like either guy was on the same page. And it's one of those, do you fault Jalen for maybe not having a better ball? Or do you fault A.J. Brown for maybe competing at the top of the route as well as you would have liked? Because when you go back and watch that replay, I can't wait to see the all 22, but on the TV copy, I thought that AJ could have fought for that a little bit harder. I thought the ball placement was fine to a degree. It just did not seem to be in sync, and we saw that a lot over the course of the game. I think A.J. Brown's stat line, having more than 100 yards in this contest, will be a bit deceiving. He had a big drop in that fourth quarter. Again, I think when you go back, you talk about why this offense isn't working tonight. It's kind of a microcosm of that. The execution just wasn't there. And when you look at, the returning pieces from last year's Super Bowl team, you have to talk about those two guys. And you also have to talk about Saquon Barkley. And he's a big reason why this offense has been good. And one of the big questions is, why isn't Saquon having the same kind of production that he did last year? So I did a little bit of digging, and I looked at it and I said, what is the big difference in Saquon's numbers? And what jumped out when you look at next gen stats, last year he was one of the best running backs in yards after contact. Excuse me. That's where the 5 a.m. is starting to kick in on me here. But he was incredible at that, and that's such a differentiating factor for running backs. This year he was 20th going into the game. And so that drop off is so huge. It relies so much on execution. And when you have to create, those spaces and those gaps before contact, that really makes such a big difference. So if Saquon's really not performing like he was a year ago, that puts so much more pressure on the passing offense. And as we saw in this game, whether it was Jalen at times, whether it was receivers at times, we can dig into coaching and scheme. It just was out of sync. And I think that's the most concerning thing if you're Philly.
I'm really happy you brought up that play. That was, I think, a really meaningful play for a few reasons. Number one, game situation. It's third down. You're not in field goal range. They're setting up for, at that point would have been a 60-yard field goal. They're not in field goal range, we know, because they went forward on fourth down on the ensuing play when they could have kicked a field goal to tie the game, and then play doesn't happen because the Chargers jump offside for a first down. But you're looking to get 4 yards. You're looking to get a first down. You don't want to make this an all or nothing play with a low percentage, obviously high upside play. If A.J. Brown catches that, you're in field goal range and you might be even scoring a touchdown. But what I found so interesting about that play, and this is not unique to this game for the Eagles, is Chargers showed a big blitz. And Jalen Hurts' reaction was, chuck it up to A.J. Let A.J. figure it out. And that has been a viable strategy at times. They've hit some game-winning or some big plays off of just, we're going to ISO A.J. Brown. But it just sort of speaks to what the answers are for this Eagles offense at times. It seems to be a lot of just, our dudes are better. And so we don't need to have, side adjustments. We don't need to have, the ability to switch up our protections and slide everything over and give Jalen Hurts time to, change the play or something. It felt like when they got that look, it was just, well, we're just chucking this one up. Doesn't matter what the game situation is. Doesn't matter, if we need a short play for a first down. Like, we're either going to get a completion or a PI, and we're going to be good. And that's just really hard to do. I mean, it's a lot harder to complete, a 35 air yard pass against a blitz when you're getting the ball out immediately because you think you're going to get zeroed and you don't have an answer for that. And it's sort of been like both the best thing and the worst thing for the Eagles is like, it's sort of like, what would be a good example? When you're like, this was never the case for me, Ben, but if you're playing like, I don't know, basketball, and you're 10 years old and you're the best player on the court, like you're like the biggest dude on the court, you don't have to develop great technique. You don't have to be a great teammate. You could just dominate with your size and your physicality and your athleticism because you're way better than everybody else and they can't match that. And for the Eagles at their best, that's what they are. Like, they're bullies in a good way. They're physically imposing. They're super talented. They're athletic. They are bigger and faster and stronger and smarter than you. And they're going to let you know that. But you have to be really good to make that work. And it feels like when you get to the run game side of things, they spent this entire season just kind of figuring, hey, our offensive line is the best, one of the best in football last year. We brought back the four most important players. We're going to figure it out. Like, we're just going to run over people at times. And they had a big run in this game, which is great, but that does not happen on a weekly basis for them. And a lot of that, I think, is injuries. Lane Johnson is out. Landon Dickerson was out of this game for a while and came back. Cam Jurgens has not been 100% this year. It just sort of feels like they're an offense that thinks we are going to bully you. And they're just not consistently able to do that. They can do it for plays, they can do it for drives, but they can't do it week in, week out. And they did do it last year, which makes it so frustrating for Eagles fans, because you don't have to go back in time to remember when this offense was doing exactly what you want it to do.
Yeah, and that's kind of why it's so fascinating to see when you look at why it's not clicking in the run game, specifically for Saquon. I'd love to go back and see what they were doing yards before contact, what Saquon was doing last year compared to this year. That can tell us, is the offensive line maybe not creating those gaps? What's the run scheme look like? Were they leaning more on maybe wide zone, inside zone, more gap scheme stuff? What have they been doing to try to alleviate that problem that they're having this year? But regardless, it is a problem. And going back to that third down, I think it's interesting because, Jalen Hurts did get zeroed on that play. You got to give Jesse Minter a ton of credit for dialing that up. And, it's interesting. If the Eagles were planning on going for it on fourth down, regardless, maybe you say, you know what, let's take a shot on this third down. We're going to get a one-on-one matchup on the outside. We know that's going to be the best look we can get. We're going to go for it on fourth. That's going to be a given. So let's see if we can get it. That being said, it's interesting because, having just covered Bengals-Bills, we talked to Bengals defensive coordinator Al Golden today about a key play in the game where Josh Allen, got a zero look and he checked to a zero beater. And then he was able to, it was a check down with the running back. He had a slide protection, and that got taken away, but then Josh was able to make a play. But I thought what was interesting was that Josh recognized that the zero was coming and then had an option to check into, okay, we feel like we've got a zero beater look in this scenario. And I think something that, I'd love to hear from the Eagles coaching staff and Jalen after the game is that if Jalen recognizes that he's going to get a zero look pre-snap, does he have something that he can go to that he feels comfortable with and say, okay, and we saw this, I think, early in the first half, and we saw Justin Herbert go to it again. One of the big plays on that touchdown drive early was that Justin, he made a pre-snap audible at the line of scrimmage. He canned what play was in the tank, and then he went and they pitched left to Omarion Hampton, and they got a good gain on that and set up for a touchdown on that drive. That's as much quarterbacking as anything that you'll see in the NFL. You have to be able to make that diagnosis at the line of scrimmage, and that goes into maybe some of the dysfunction that we're seeing with that Philadelphia offense schematically, and I think that's something that we'll get more information as the season goes on.
Yeah, and I think if you're a good coordinator, a good coach, you're sort of working off of like a multi-play sequence. Like the Eagles, over the last recent few years, because of the tush push, it's changed the way they've been able to play offense because it changes the way teams play defense. Like, you, as a defense, cannot play, at the sticks. We're going to rally and make a tackle 1 or 2 yards short because the Eagles are going to run the tush push and they're probably going to succeed in it. And I know it hasn't been quite as successful this year. Jalen Hurts did fumble against the Bears on a tush push. That unfortunately did not go well for the Eagles. But on that third and, I think it was 3rd and 4, right, on that play?
I believe so, yes.
Third and 4 because they get the first down with the neutral zone infraction for 5 yards. That's probably a rundown for the Eagles. And so if Jesse Minter knows, okay, if they get 2 yards on the ground, which, they might get, they might get stuffed. They got stuffed plenty of times in this game, but like you'd figure like the average expectation is probably 2-3 yards on a run there. Well, now you're in tush push zone. And so you can't give up 2 or 3 yards. And so now, as Jesse Minter, you say, okay, well, I can't do that. What can I do to hold them to no gain? Well, I can zero blitz. I can blitz the hell out of them and turn it into an all or nothing down. And so if you're Nick Sirianni, if you're Kevin Patullo, you sort of have to know, like, yeah, that's probably what we're going to get, because they don't want us to get a single more yard. They want us to either attempt a 4th and 4 with the outside of tush push range, or they want us to kick a 60-yard field goal. They do not want us to get anything. And so, if that was their answer, and it has been their answer against the blitz at times this year, okay, whatever. Like you said, maybe you take that shot. But I think it doesn't feel like the Eagles are exploiting the advantages they've had in years past in quite the same way. And, with a good staff, with a good coach, and I wrote about Nick Sirianni a couple of weeks ago, and it was fascinating because, like, I brought up the man's resume. It's pretty much the best resume for any coach through the first 4+ years in recent NFL history, in terms of the playoff success, in terms of the regular season success. And yet Eagles fans want to overwhelmingly fire this guy. And, it's not like he's like a widely popular national coach. Like, I think there's a widespread perception that maybe he's being brought along for the ride with the talent as opposed to the other way around. And there's probably some truth to that. I explore that in the piece. But it just feels like such a unique dynamic because we've seen it before. I think that's what makes this tougher more than anything else, is when you see an offense operating at its peak for a long stretch of time, where you have an MVP candidate running back, superstar wide receivers, a quarterback who never loses, and then it falls apart the following year, or it struggles the following year, it's like, you don't need to imagine what it's like. You could just go back to what you saw 12 months ago and say, wow, this is what this should be. This is what I know this can be. And it's not. And because all the players are there, you're going to see the coaches blamed. And I don't think that's wrong necessarily, but I just think it's like, it would have been easier in a strange way if this was the 2024 offense. Like, if we hadn't seen them be so good in 24, I don't think Eagles fans would be quite as frustrated. They'd be upset because you don't want to lose games, but like, it's just sort of like, you've seen this offense be nearly perfect. And so it becomes so difficult to accept anything less than that if you're an Eagles fan right now.
Listen, if you're a disgruntled Eagles fan, I get it, but also I'm sure there's a copy of the most recent Super Bowl victory from just a few months ago, just somewhere around the house. Just pop it in. Sometimes when you get a little upset, I should buy you a little bit of patience, but I get it, when you look at it. And I'll be honest, I have been a Sirianni doubter in the past. I thought that, sometimes, I think that, the way that he comes off, you always hear good coaches will say you never get too high, never get too low. Sirianni seems to break that rule. And so that's usually the one cardinal rule you cannot break as a head coach. Mm-hmm. And I asked a guy who played for him about this, and he goes, no. Guys love playing for Nick. Like, I was a little skeptical at first, but then, there's a lot of buy-in to what he does over there. And that was, I think if you are a doubter of Sirianni, like myself, that definitely changes the perception of kind of how he leads that team. And I think when you have that many pieces, and we've all seen A.J. Brown read the book and A.J. Brown really want the ball, that is not an easy thing as well. It's when you have that many guys who feel like they should be involved. And most of the time, especially being around, players in locker rooms, when they feel that way, it's because they feel like they can make an impact on the game. That's where that comes from. And how do they channel that energy in a positive way? That can be some of the tricky parts for a coaching staff that doesn't have to do with X's and O's. And I understand that challenge as well. But when you look at where this thing's moving forward, again, just trying to find a rhythm that just seemed to be lacking tonight. And even if the Eagles had found a way to make a couple plays in overtime, that feeling would still persist as they go on because, for a team that's got championship aspirations, they need to be playing better than they did tonight against the Chargers.
Yeah, I mean, like, you can't turn the ball five over five times and expect to win. Like, I'm not going to say it never happens, but I mean, look at the Ravens when they played the Bengals a couple weeks ago. Like, they turned the ball over 5 times, and that was a winnable game for them, and they lost to a likely inferior team, especially on the defensive side of the football. First thing I saw in this game that I have never seen before, Ben, I have to ask you, have you ever seen a quarterback, or any player, I guess, throw an interception and lose a fumble on the same play?
I have not. Do you know the stats for when that has happened last?
I believe it has not happened since 1978, or like in the the data goes back as far as 1978, and it has not happened to any quarterback over that time frame.
Correct, which is mind blowing. And
Yes.
and as the play happened, I said, hold on, there were 3 turnovers in a single play, which is absurd. I believe when we went back and looked at ESPN research said that happened once. I believe it was a Packers-Cowboys game recently, but it was kind of an end-of-game scenario. There were a ton of laterals, so not a normal play. Not that this was a normal play, but I think it just goes to show how wacky this game really felt. It seemed like, Justin Herbert was just under duress the entirety of the game. I saw an old friend in Bobby Hart, who used to be a Bengals right tackle. I am stunned that Bobby has done, I shouldn't say stunned, I should say I'm happy that Bobby has been able to carve out a career for himself for this long. He got a lot of ire from Bengals fans. I used to say, listen, Bobby Hart, I believe, was a 7th-round pick. So for him to have a long career, he's played above his draft slot. But I imagine the Chargers would have liked for Bobby not to play tonight, especially given the offensive line issues. So it was just a wacky game all around. And I think that one play encapsulated that feeling.
It's funny you bring up the offensive line issues, because that's the other thing I don't believe I have ever seen before, Ben. According to the NFL's Next Gen Stats, Justin Herbert was pressured on 68.3% of his dropbacks in this game. Over 68%. That is an absurd number. I mean, you cover Joe Burrow and the Bengals. You have seen plenty of high pressure rates. Justin Herbert's style, he wants to extend plays. He's going to scramble, especially this year. He's going to take a lot of hits. He's going to run a high pressure rate. This is a very good Eagles front, even without Jalen Carter, who did not play in this game. Trey Pipkins got hurt. That like you said, Bobby Hart came in. That impacted things. But Ben, a 68% pressure rate is insane. How? I mean, I guess what I would ask is this, because Justin Herbert took a lot of hits in this game for a quarterback with a broken hand. Do you feel like Justin Herbert should have been in this game?
That's a good question. And it's something that, quite frankly, I wrestle with a good amount, is how much do you allow players who feel like they can play, have them play in the game, versus should someone basically hold them back and say, we understand you want to go out there and help the team, but
Sure.
It's probably in your best interest if you sit this one out. And I think that's a struggle that players go through all the time. And, if Herbert felt like, he could play through the injury, that he had the surgery to repair that broken hand, he had the padding on there, the glove, if he felt like he could play through it, then, I think that's up to the doctors, up to the medical staff, and ultimately it's up to him to figure out how much tolerance of pain he can deal with. And it was admirable to see him go out there, take the hits. He ran the ball a ton, especially late in the game when the Chargers really needed it. I was not expecting a heavy dose of Justin Herbert read options. I felt like I was watching some Big 12 football from the mid-2010s out there. And listen, if I'm the edge rush, if I'm on the edge, I would crash out on the running back every time.
Yeah, of course you would.
I'm not expecting Justin Herbert to take it and go off, but it's also interesting that seemed like at times the best offense they had. You talked about the Vidal, reception early in the game. That was the longest reception that the Chargers had all night, and that was a large chunk of their passing yardage in this game. And so, it just felt that it was, whether it was the pressure, whether he kind of maybe bailed out of pockets a little early at times. Sometimes we'll see a quarterback be under duress early in a game, and that really sticks with them over the course of a contest. And you also have to wonder how much was Herbert maybe trying to make sure that he didn't put himself in situations where he didn't know where he was getting hit from, where he can maybe brace and say, okay, protect that hand as much as possible. So, maybe that's why we're seeing that absurd number of pressures. But regardless, I give Herbert credit for playing through all of that. I will be honest, Bill, I thought he could have handled the postgame interview a little bit better with Laura Rutledge. I thought that was a little ridiculous if you're the winning quarterback, just stand there, take a couple questions and keep it moving. But all in all, I thought the performance, it was really gutsy. It's really the best way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, that 60-yard catch and run from Kamani Vidal on a check down early in this game, that's 60 yards. The other 70 plays the Chargers ran amassed a total of 215 net yards, just over 3 yards per play for the Chargers across those other snaps. It really was interesting like you said, when they needed big plays late in the game, they went to the Herbert zone read. I mean, it really was not, once I was like, okay, great call. You got them. You slid, great. You don't need to do this again. And then they did it again in overtime and it worked again. So, full credit to them. But just a weird thing. I mean, you go back even earlier in the game, Herbert they were playing in the shotgun, which makes sense given that you don't want to have Herbert under center as much as you can, given the hand issue. And he checked to a play that brought him under center. And it was like, okay, well, maybe there were some rules on you heading into the game. And maybe those rules don't apply once you actually start the game. I don't know how much Jim Harbaugh believes in medicine and believes in hand power. The broadcast was talking about how he played through a meniscus tear or a repaired meniscus a few days before a game. So it didn't sound like maybe the best practices were being followed there. But I do think, certainly you're right in that it was a gutsy performance from Justin Herbert and an essential one, right? I mean, he led the team in rushing, picked up multiple first downs. The plays they had as a passer were him scrambling to create opportunities. Some drops, and I think some, frankly, excellent coverage from the Eagles secondary. I thought they had a really good game outside of the Vidal sort of blown coverage, which I think was more on the linebackers than the secondary. But just felt like a game where the Eagles defense did more than enough to win, and the Eagles offense kind of handed it back to the Chargers in some ways.
Yeah, like you said earlier, when you turn the ball over that many times, it's just impossible to win in the NFL when you do that. You put your team in such a tough position. And like you said, the Eagles defensively put Herbert under duress. He did not look comfortable. They had to run a lot. And you talk about going to that zone read. That's a way to alleviate some of that pressure when that pressure just accumulates over time. When he's not going to have time to go through a proper progression, you might as well have him try to run a little bit, steal some yards as much as you can late in the game. And so, I think if you're the Eagles, you're going to really kick yourself for letting this one slip away, especially, when at the very least you had a position to at least get out of there with a tie. It's almost like we're watching a good EPL game where you said, listen, it's not our best performance. We're on the road here. Let's just go get a point and go home. But they end up giving up a goal in stoppage time and they lose all points. And I think if you're the Eagles, that's kind of what happened here.
Yeah, and it felt more like a frustrating loss for the Eagles than like a triumphant win for the Chargers. Herbert mentioned the numbers for the total net yards, but Herbert 12 of 26 for 139, touchdown and a pick. Also lost a fumble on a strip sack. Fumbled multiple times in this game. I mean, he was struggling to protect the football when, like you said, he was not able to brace for a hit. We didn't know where the hits were coming from, or they happened quicker than he would have hoped. But outside of that 60-yard long catch and run, the other 25 pass attempts get just 79 yards for Herbert in this game. The tough part for the Chargers moving forward, Ben, and, I don't know if Jim Harbaugh thinks this way, but, kind of feel like he might have to. They're 9-4, and you would really love to have a spot where you could sit Herbert for a week. I know Trey Lance is, I'm excited to watch Trey Lance. I don't know if anybody else is, but they're 9-4. They're still in the thick of the AFC West divisional race. They're in the wild card picture. They're heavy favorites to finish with a spot, which would be great. But their final 4 games at the Chiefs, who, I don't know if the Chiefs are good, but they're all in to win. Like I promise you, they're going to be putting everything they have into these final few games of the year to try and sneak into the postseason. They're out if they don't beat the chart. The chart, they might literally be, I don't know if they're eliminated, but they're basically eliminated if they don't beat the Chargers in Kansas City next week. At the Cowboys, who, are on the fringes of the NFC playoff picture, and certainly a team that suddenly has a very stout interior defensive line, hosting the Texans, who are in the AFC wildcard picture and who have a terrifying set of edge rushers. And they finish up at the Broncos, which could be for the division title and could be a game where you're facing maybe the best defensive front in football. If the Eagles are not, or if a handful of other teams are not, the Broncos certainly belong in that discussion as well. And so I guess, Ben, my question is, how do you sort of handle the rest of the season if you're the Chargers? Herbert was tough. He made a bunch of big runs in this game, but it wasn't like he was a consistently effective passer. I mean, if they do lose one or two of these games, but they are in postseason contention still, or if they are in, basically locked into a playoff spot, would you try to rest Herbert for a week? Do you think Jim Harbaugh would even consider that possibility?
I think that's a great question. I think it's going to honestly depend medically if the rest, what that will do for Herbert. Is it okay if we give him a week off? Will that help? Maybe reduce the risk of him, aggravating the
Right.
hand injury, or is it something where if we give him that extra time, it could give it time to heal, give it rest, strengthen it a little bit. I think that's going to be the big question. So I think that's a question for kind of the doctors and the PTs to maybe answer a little bit better. But in terms of where their seating is at, as you went through and kind of posed the question, I looked it up on our internal analytics, and it looks like, right now the Chargers, their best shot is going to be trying to sneak in and get one of those wild card spots. With their, between the 5th through 7th seeds, our most updated numbers, that's where they've got the double-digit percentages of getting one of those seeds, getting a top 4 seed or winning the division. That seems to be really, really steep. So right now, I think their path is relatively clear. If they do what they're projected to, they're going to end up getting a wild card spot. So if you are able to clinch that by week 17, you're able to rest Herbert, I think that's a perfect scenario. You'd want to do that in general. But ultimately, going back to your question about best practices moving forward, I think part of the job of being a head coach, and as someone, again, who covers Joe Burrow, I'm very familiar with this. As the offensive play caller and the head coach, it's your duty to manage around what your quarterback can and can't do and put them in situations, while yes, they might be playing through something, also making sure you reduce the risk as much as possible, altering the game plan to where you can try to put something out that you can win with, but you can also protect your franchise quarterback. I mean, going back to the best example, in my opinion, is when you go back to 2023 when Joe Burrow was dealing with a strained calf. I remember he re-aggravated it early in the season. They had a Monday night game against the Los Angeles Rams, I believe. Owner Mike Brown was like, "Please, son, do not play on this. I would really like it if you didn't." And Burrow essentially said, "Thank you, Mr. Brown. I'm playing anyways." And he did. And then Zach Taylor, had to make sure that he tailored the game plan, no pun intended, to make sure that Burrow, was as protected as possible while still running a functioning offense. They were able to win that game. But I think that's the balance that you have to take as a head coach for as long as your quarterback feels like he can play.
And, when I watch sort of like media coverage of quarterbacks like Joe Burrow, like Justin Herbert, even like a Jaden Daniels maybe, you sort of see this thing about like, oh, avoid big hits, like get the ball out quicker, avoid hits. And Herbert does take big hits at the end of plays. He does take unnecessary hits as a scrambler, but like in the pocket, he's not taking hits for the sake of taking hits. Like he's trying to move around, trying to make plays. Like that the benefit of that outweighs the risk of taking the hit. Burrow, the same thing. Like he's going to extend plays here and there because that's something he does to create a lot of value for the offense. You don't want to take that out of him and like minimize that creativity, that improvisation. That's such an incredibly valuable and unique and special skill for these guys. And so I just feel like you can't really protect Herbert from himself in a lot of ways. He's had big hit injuries before. Remember the rib injury he played through in years past, where it looked like he was just in agony after every drive. Um, I don't think there's really much you can do. And so I think if you're having him out there, it's an all or nothing thing. Like I don't think you can have him out there and expect him to not be scrambling, expect him not to check to plays under center. Like you just have to accept it's either the real Justin Herbert or he's not playing at all. And that I think, unfortunately, for the health of Justin Herbert, maybe the best thing for the Chargers in the short term is for him to play. I just think it'd be so upsetting if you have a compromised Justin, make it to the postseason and your Justin Herbert is compromised and can't really play up to the level he was hoping for because he's hurt. And then I mentioned the Charger schedule. Let's finish up here with the Eagles schedule on the other side of things here. I know Eagles fans feel like the earth is collapsing underneath them. They have lost 3 straight games after going 8-2 to begin the year. I know the 2023 comparisons are all over the place in Philadelphia. Number one, that team could not play defense to save their lives. This team's defense is still really good. And number two, they're going to get some help from the schedule makers. in the weeks to come, Ben. They host the Raiders next week. I'll tell you what, if they lose to the Raiders, then there will be a crisis. Then people are getting fired. If they lose to the Raiders at home next week, that is when things are going really wrong. They're at the Commanders, who knows who's going to be left playing for the Commanders at that point. At the Bills, which will be a fun game, 425 game, surprisingly. But a fun game, Eagles, Bills, and then they finish up hosting the Commanders in week 18. Does feel like the schedule is going to make things easier. Might get some victories, might not be as satisfying as Eagles fans would hope. But I guess the question I would finish up with here, Ben, for you is this. Knowing the schedule is easy, knowing there's still a month of football to go, knowing unless it's truly awful, they're going to still win the NFC East and host a playoff game in the wild card round. What do you think Eagles fans should want to see from this team over the next month to feel like when they do play a meaningful game again in the postseason, that they are in better shape than they are right now?
You know, I think the biggest thing is that you want to see, again, going back, you want the offense to be clicking a little bit more, but more specifically, I think you want to see more sustained drives, some more sustained offense. When you look at their numbers, the amount of 3 and outs, the amount of drives they have with no first downs, among one of the leaders in the NFL in that category, that's a sign of just clearly inefficient offense. And when you're banking on explosives to offset that, you know, in previous years, going back to Saquon, when he's able to reel off those big plays, you know, you don't have to worry about that as much. But guess what? That's not really happening this year. And quite frankly, the Eagles almost got bailed out from an atypical Saquon Barkley long run that gave them that touchdown in the fourth quarter. That's something that had been lacking from this offense, and it almost kind of papered over some of these other issues. And the beauty of an NFL season is that after 17 games, you know, it's very clear what your team is, what your team is good at, what you're bad at, and you can't really, you know, get away with ignoring some of those aspects. So as they move forward, you want to see them find ways to sustain offense. You want to see them, you know, maybe get on the same page with Jalen Hurts. You know, I thought getting Devontae Smith involved, making sure that A.J. Brown is happy and getting, you know, the production that he needs. And quite frankly, I also thought, you know, A.J., you know, had some struggles in this game, but I also thought he won on some routes and the ball placement wasn't where it needed to be. And so sometimes it's just taking everybody, making sure that they're executing at a high level, as cliche as that sounds, to getting that offense right. And if you're able to do that, then you can feel better about going into the playoffs and feel like you can kind of make a little bit of noise if things fall your way.
Yeah, the consistency thing is such a good point. You're completely correct. What's interesting, though, is you go, so they're 26th in the NFL in success rate right now, which is, I think ours is based on EPA. There are other ones with outsiders in the past was based on yardage. But the idea of like, how often are you staying on schedule? How often are you, you know, putting your team in a position where after each play, you're more likely to get a first down or a touchdown than you were on the prior play. 26th in the league right now. Last year, I think they'd be great given how good the offense was. They were only 16th. They were only a league average offense by success rate. And the disconnect there, of course, is last year they were hitting Saquon 50-yard touchdown runs every single week. They were hitting a ton of explosives. And this year, at least in the run game, there's been basically no explosives. I think they get 5 20-plus yard runs this entire season for the Eagles. And so I guess you're hoping the explosives do come back. You know, the Saquon run this week was a positive sign. Like, you're not going to be upset if Saquon bails you out with a 50-plus yard touchdown every week. But it does feel like that has to get better. I just feel, to your point, like they don't have to be, you know, the Chiefs, or I guess the Chiefs are maybe a bad example these days. But the Lions have a really good success rate every year. The Rams right now, number 1 in the NFL in success rate. The Bills, number 3. Just that, like, we're consistently hitting chunk plays and moving the ball downfield. That needs to get better. They're never going to be like a top 5 offense by success rate, but if they can be a league average success rate over the rest of the year and they can get a few more explosives, maybe they're not the 2024 offense, but maybe there's something closer. And if there's something closer, this defense is playing well enough that they're going to win a lot of games. Like this is a defense where, especially when they get Jalen Carter back, it's the old cliche. You're not going to want to see this defense in the postseason. You frankly are going to want to see this offense in the postseason right now, which is not something Eagles fans were expecting. But if they could just be an average offense, this would be a really tough out for teams in the postseason.
Yeah, I mean, this defense is just solid. You look at what they do to opposing quarterbacks, how difficult they make. The Chargers, were among the teams that have now had problems against Philly with just completing passes and just having a functional passing attack. And really last year, I thought in that Super Bowl, as good as the offense played at times, it was really the defense just heated up Patrick Mahomes and really put him under pressure early. And that was the difference in the entire game. You saw him playing so much faster because the Eagles have that front, they have that defense that puts opposing offenses under so much pressure. And we've seen that be a theme throughout this season, that if you have a defense, especially a defensive front that can wreak havoc and really, pressure and heat up some of these dynamic quarterbacks, it gives you a great shot to be successful in any given game. And if your offense can just take care of the ball, stay on schedule, do the little things, that puts you in a really good spot. So I think you're exactly on the money.
Yeah, I mean, this team last year in the postseason, 1 turnover in 4 games. Down the stretch, they went turnover-free in 6 of their final 8 games. And then early in the year, weren't turning the ball over. 3 turnovers in their first 8 games of the season. They have 9 over their last 3 games in this losing streak, including 2 on 1 play tonight. Something, again, I feel like I have never seen covering football. We've made it 2 weeks. Last week, I had never seen the Younghoe Koo kick into the ground where he missed the ball entirely on an NFL field goal attempt. I'm intrigued to see if we can make it 3 weeks, 3 Monday Night Football games in a row where I've seen something I have never seen before. We get Dolphins and Steelers next week. I'm afraid to see what that could be with Tua and Aaron Rodgers with Ben Baby. That is not your problem. You've had a long day. You can go to sleep. But before that, Ben, where can people check out your coverage of the NFL?
Yeah, Bill, anything for you. I'm always happy to stay up late and hang out. We got no cricket references in, which I am stunned with. I had one lined up, but I decided not to let it bang.
I watched 12 hours of the Ashes on Saturday.
Oh, that sounds like a great time, to be honest with you.
It wasn't for England, I'll tell you that much.
Listen, as an Indian fan right now, there's not a whole lot of good that's happening. So we're getting just the break speed off us by South Africa. But that's another, so we could do another 45 minutes if we wanted to on this. But to answer your question, on the ESPN app is where you can find a lot of our stuff. We'll cover what's going on with this Bengals team. A lot of big questions moving forward for a team that is going to miss the playoffs most likely for the 3rd straight year. There's a lot of questions about how upset is Joe Burrow? His press conference after the game against the Bills, a lot of people have dissected that and said, what does that really mean? Does he have that fire in him? And I think that's a very fascinating question. I've never thought that once about Joe, but it's a question that people have. So on ESPN.com and then on Instagram, on Threads, at BBaby41, and then the other various platforms where I'll be out and around, and we'll see it's such a fascinating team, and like Kansas City, like Baltimore, the Bengals, teams that were so good a few years ago, this year just can't seem to find the right mix. And now as this AFC gets more crowded, can these teams with really great quarterbacks, can they find a way to build around them and get them back to the top of the AFC? Such a fascinating conversation that I'm excited to follow.
Yeah, I mean, a crazy year in the AFC. We might be getting Phillip Rivers back in the AFC for this postseason run. I mean, it feels like anything is possible right now. Chiefs missing the postseason, Phillip Rivers back at quarterback. It's just total chaos right now in the AFC, and Ben Davey does great work covering the Bengals side of that for us at ESPN. Ben, please go get some rest, but we will talk about cricket and everything else NFL related soon.
Sounds good, Bill. Thank you so much for having me.